Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. I need to say to you guys that I greatly appreciate the support from the community in general over the original L-19 review video. Clearly, although in jest, you guys did see the product for what it was at the time. Broken and unfinished in my opinion. This didn't stop the commercial developer from attempting to discredit me on every channel, ranging from personal attacks against my character and just outright childish behavior. Although I do have a number of opinions about this studio, I'll keep them to myself and proceed with what I aim to provide you with all my reviews, which is an objective look at the product as best as I can offer you. In fairness to you guys, I'm not sure if I am capable at this point of being completely separated from the prior actions of this company and being completely unbiased, so I will keep my opinions limited and try to focus on what I can or cannot reproduce in this aircraft now that the developer has released an update for it. I am going to skip over the review portions of the exterior model that you see on screen right now, and the interior model comments as they were covered in detail in the first review, which you can find a link for in the comments below. This review will strictly cover the differences between that model and this update, which, to be fair, are many. In short, it's not next generation good, the exterior model, but I do like the model and I'm fine with the quality. It holds up just fine under most circumstances, except for close scrutiny, especially with a few liveries that have lower texture resolutions. That's okay in my opinion, because there are a dozen or so liveries available, and most are actually very nice. So we begin this revisit with the download install of the newest version. The installer, easy enough to use, correctly identified the install edition that I have and extracted the aircraft to that location. It also put an item in my start menu, which seems to be both a copy of the Army's operating manual and a very comprehensive one actually from Black Box Simulations, which is in fact a Canadian Forces publication operating manual that he has rebranded as Black Box Simulations operating manual. It works well, and I'm guessing he received permission from the Canadian Forces to redistribute and publish under his name. Personally, I've never flown an L-19 in real life, but I have seen the tail end of one on many occasions, as the aircraft is the official Canadian Forces tow plane for their cadet gliding program, which is where I first learned to fly over 30 years ago in the CF-BT, as we used to call them, the orange glider is short for Canadian Forces bathtub. So here we loaded it for a cold and dark, and as far as I can see, it's extremely realistic so far, as my wife seems to have followed me to the back seat. Uncharacteristically quiet, but silently judging. First thing I notice, the POV is now usable, the point of view, which is the default view. This wasn't noted in his changelog, but I guess if too many of these items made that list, it would have started looking like he may have watched my prior review and took notes. There still isn't proper usage of the instrument views or the POV hat switch to cycle through them. I think this is incredibly important for people without head tracking and an easy way to look around the cockpit. Part of the changelog is the switches, according to his changelog, quote, flipped to standard configuration, up equals on. This looks correct. The switches now switch in the correct orientation. I have yet to see a non-standard configuration, down. I digress. Like I said, we loaded this cold and dark so that I could go through a standard procedure start on this. There's not a lot to this aircraft, and I could not get this started. I tried multiple times using tricks I had learned from my first round of experiences with it. It just wouldn't start. The changelog does say engine starter fixed, true cold and dark operation. I'd like to think I'm doing something wrong here. If the developer can confirm that I am, I will try again, and I will post my findings in the top pinned post for this video in the comment section below. I truly could not get this started. For reference, I recognize that in the process of reviewing this aircraft, I was playing with many of the switches before trying to start, and that this could have introduced a bug that has gone unnoticed. That's fair. So I restarted 3 times and went straight to start, or from cold and dark to starting it, for this very purpose. I found that if I pressed Ctrl-E to start it, leaned it out until it shut off, and then pressed the start button to restart it, I could get it started. I could not, however, start it from cold and dark. I think there might still be some debugging to do here. I spent over an hour. Not on the changelog is mention of the gauges, which have removed whatever reflective or otherwise layer that was previously making them look like they had been melted. They look much better than before in that respect. Obviously, the model itself and its polygon count has remained the same. Also not on the changelog is mention of all the visual glitches on the instrument panel, which is a huge improvement in this version. Much less distracting, much cleaner look now, and much less bright. If I may be as so bold to make a suggestion, a weathered texture might be in order to match some of the nice weathered liveries offered. On that note, I believe there are 2 more liveries offered in version 1.2, which is nice, because I like most of them. On the changelog, fuel selector knob, reanimated and corrected left off right. This seems to be correct now. On the changelog, mirror fixed, now reflective. I'm just going to give this one to them. There are still no sounds modeled on the switches, which, contrary to the idea that was proposed to me that you can't hear the switches when the engine is on, you certainly can whilst it's off. That stall buzzer is definitely not indicative of what it would have sounded like in an L-19, but it's not unheard of that if you owned one of these, you would have long ago replaced that to something more modern. Anyways, let's take this up and get some flight time in. I do want to mention that in the prior video, I was incredibly frustrated with loading this model, as the majority of the time it would load either frozen or invisible, and something wouldn't work or would be different almost every time I loaded it. That hasn't happened to me once since version 1.2 update, so that's excellent news, and then I can focus a little bit more time on flying and evaluating the flight characteristics than just trying to get the model working. I also want to note that the developer made quite a big deal in the prior versions that even with all the problems present, and there were many, that the flight characteristics or the flight model of this aircraft was so accurate that it was worth buying for that alone, potentially with even all those problems. And we'll get to that in a second. First, I'd just like to note that everything aside, I did have fun in this bird and the amphibian today, flying them around, being able to focus a little bit more on flying than troubleshooting. As I was flying this aircraft around, though, there are some particular flight characteristics of this that threw me off almost right away. The largest one being the stall characteristics of this aircraft. It didn't feel right, first of all. But I don't want you to take my word for it. Let's be a little more methodical with this. Let's first take a look at the setup here. I'm going to make the total weight of this aircraft 1,800 pounds, and there's a good reason for that, and we'll take a look at that in just 1 second. But let's get this as close to 1,800 pounds as possible. Now, while I'm doing that in the background, let's take a look at the manual provided by Black Box Simulations to give us some information about this aircraft. What we have on screen here is the stall speeds, or the power-off stall speeds, of this aircraft under different configurations, and we're particularly interested here in the clean configuration, or 0 degrees of flaps. And you can see why I set it to 1,800, because it says gross weight here in pounds 1,800, and at level flight we should have a stall speed of 47 miles per hour. With that information in hand, let's take off here and keep that information in the back of your mind when we get this aircraft in level flight. We're just going to push up on the stick a little bit to get her in level flight. She is a little squirrely on the runway. I think I mentioned this in the first review. I don't think that's probably any bit more abnormal than the real aircraft. And now that I understood that the pitch wheel is backwards, it was much easier to take off with much less deflection of the stick, and she lifted off the ground a little bit there, and I kept it in level flight so that we don't stall coming out of the runway and into the trees. So I'm just checking that my flaps are up. I want to make sure, in order to do this test properly, that I'm running this in a clean configuration without any flaps. And with that said, in order for us to have enough altitude to perform these tests, I'm just going to climb to 2,000 feet to give us enough room to do any type of stall recoveries or spins. And I apologize for you having to watch me take off here and climb to altitude without just showing you this footage, but I think it's important for continuity that I show setting the aircraft up with 1,800 pounds, showing the wings clean, and performing the test so that you understand that there was no cuts or edits or footage added or removed. While we're waiting for that, I'm going to summarize all of the issues that I brought to light in the first review and whether or not they've been addressed in the version 1.2 update, because I think this has been a good update, and I think it's important to note how many of these items have been addressed and whether or not this is in functional form for you to consider. After the kickback from the developer over the original review, I offered him a breakdown of it so that he wouldn't have to watch it, and instead I broke it up into two categories of items that needed to be fixed to make the aircraft usable, and another category of items that just needed to be done in order to make the aircraft a $40 model. Let's go over the first ones here, and I think he's done a great job. In version 1.2, you can see all the green. It was either fixed or it didn't happen to me during this review. The only thing left for discussion here is he didn't offer the Microsoft default POV hat switch views. I think that instrument view is extremely important for people without head tracking. Now, are the magnetos broken still? I don't know, because I can't get it started. So maybe they are modeled correctly, and maybe there's another reason why I can't get a cold and dark start. Which brings us to the only other really red item on the list, which is I cannot start this using proper procedures, or any procedures for that matter. At least I had some tricks in the prior review. And although I assumed the trim wasn't working, I did figure out that it, by default now, is actually in a much better position. The problem is I wouldn't fly the plane off the runway in a default configuration because I would first look down at my trim wheel and set it, as most pilots would. And when I set it to the correct setting, which was for takeoff, it was pitched down and into the runway. And when I tried to fix it by doing more pitch, because it's backwards and labeled wrong, I'd have even more pitch into the runway. That is resolved. I understand what I was doing. I wasn't doing anything wrong. And this still needs to be fixed. You either need to change the labels or flip which way the trim wheel works. And with that, we are back in our aircraft at enough altitude to perform this test. And if you look at the throttle at the bottom left, this is a power off stall. So I've got the throttle back to idle, and we're slowly approaching what should be our stall speed at 47 miles per hour. But as you see clearly, this aircraft, and I felt that this was the case, but this confirms it, stalls at the same speed regardless of its configuration or weight. Now, the only difference in stall speed I can find is during a flaps full or dirty configuration versus a clean configuration. There is around 5 to 7 or 8 mile an hour at most difference here. And that's pretty close to its actual stall speeds between those configurations. Now, there was another list that I created that, in my opinion, were things that if you wanted to compete with the likes of Coronado's Mooney, for instance, you have to be up to snuff on these items. Clearly, in my opinion, when buying a $40 model, there are certain expectations that go along with purchasing that, and assumptions. Number one, the interior textures need improvement, along with all the visual glitches that seem to pop out. Now granted, the version 1.2 does fix most of the ones that I saw on the interior in the prior model. The gauges looked horrible in the first model. They've been improved. They look infinitely better, especially on the black dash. The interior polygon count is FSX at best, and the volt amp gauge says it's modeled on their marketing material, but clearly isn't. And many sounds are also not modeled. The gear switch and indicator not being in the float plane is a big deal. My wife was kind of getting tired of climbing out into the pontoons on approach, but that's been fixed. Well, functionally anyways, it has introduced a visual glitch on the switch and lights that have been added, but that's what I'm talking about. These types of things shouldn't have to be put up with for a model of this cost. But before I conclude, let's take a look at what was exciting me most about purchasing this model in the first place, the float plane. Now, I like the new livery, Canadian of course, and if you take a look at the dash here, it is much nicer looking than the version 1.1 model. And clearly the gauges haven't changed other than that weird reflection and all those errors. The same polygon count. They look so much better though with that black dash and it not being so bright. They're just, I don't know everything that's changed here, as he didn't put anything in the changelog, but I just will say it does look a lot better. It almost looks like he remodeled it. It makes that much of a difference, just the textures. And I know I have commented on the lack of sounds, but the sounds that are here do sound acceptable. They're not amazing by any means, but they're not bad either. They sound good. They're believable enough. And I actually do like the sound of the pontoons on the water. It was kind of on the edge for a while. When you're moving a little bit slower with the pontoons, the sound, it sounds a little bit too fast, if that makes sense. It should be more of a sloshing sound when you're going slower, but I'm getting pretty picky. Of course, that's been created in the interactions we've had over the last few days. Regardless, the sounds, they're pretty good to me. I wouldn't have picked on them otherwise. Most importantly, we just landed on water, and that was kind of a sticking point for me. So I've done maybe half a dozen water landings, and I haven't had any issues with stress to the aircraft or it crashing on land. This amphibious also lands quite controllably on regular asphalt or gravel airstrips. So where do we stand? My original opinion was that this model has a lot of problems and was released too early. I said that the model had a lot of potential, but wasn't on par with something like the Carinado Mooney for the same price. The update from the developer was welcome, but he missed the point to begin with. It should have never been released in this state. I do, however, applaud the quick release of those glaring issues in this version 1.2. I hope that Black Box Simulations continues this trend. Keep in mind, the context for a lot of this opinion is based on the price of this module. If this model was $10, I could accept it for what it is, a work in progress that shares assets from a previous generation. I could then maybe just enjoy the floats. If cost or realism isn't your primary concern, it may hold you over if you want to get your water wings today. I don't know if this review is going to convince anyone to buy it, but I'd like to think that the last review played a small part in convincing the developer to fix it for those who had already done so. To conclude this review in a similar fashion from my last, there have been other glowing reviews about the realism of the flight model of this aircraft, including one which stated, "This is the first real aircraft I found since release." I don't necessarily share that viewpoint, but as I take off from English Bay with some of my most precious cargo, my wife, in tow, and have forgotten to put my gear up on the last water landing, I can only thank God it isn't.